Welcome to day 2 of Radio Week. Today's session is also another one under the broad heading of management and strategy. Yesterday, we talked about how to run a radio station in the 21st century, competing for Gen Z ears and attention against TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, you name them. It was a pretty impressive session. We've got some excellent tips from all of our panelists. Today, we discuss how to make your on-demand strategies work. Thank you, wherever you're watching from around the world, for joining us for this particular session. Now, this panel that you're looking at right now on screen, very carefully selected. You can see that there's a lot of wisdom here, not just because of age, but these guys have each worked in traditional radio for decades, each of them. And that was very important for this session because we're talking to a lot of radio managers who are grappling with this challenge that they have about competing in the on-demand space or adding that as part of their quiver. I think quiver is the right word, right? When you have a pack of arrows, I don't know, that's from the Middle Ages. I'm not from there, although quite old. Now, they've all worked in traditional radio, but they've crossed over to the dark side at different times, some more recently, some time ago. And I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into their CVs. Chris Boyce worked in radio at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for 10 years, starting as a programmer before rising to the top job, the executive director, radio and audio for CBC's English services in July 2011. In 2015, he left public service radio to co-found Pacific Content. Pacific Content creates podcasts and original audio content for major blue chip brands in the US and maybe even in Canada, where he comes from. Stephen Goldstein has done everything in radio in the US for 36 years, launching NBC's Youth Radio Network in 1979. Then he went on to work in programming at WABC in New York and WTIC in Connecticut and WHYT in Detroit, culminating in a 28-year career as Executive VP and Group Program Director at Sega Communications. And in April 2015, he founded Amplify Media, which supports media companies with content and strategy in on-demand audio. And then Chris Bannon. His career in radio started in 1992 as a marketer on Minnesota Public Radio's legendary Prairie Home Companion. He joined New York's much heralded WNYC in 2002 as a producer, rising to program director in 2006 and vice president content development and production in 2012. In 2015, he left Linear to join Stitcher, which, if you don't know, is a media company that specializes in the creation, distribution, and monetization of podcasts, as chief content officer. And he's now the SVP and head of global audio for Condé Nast. So there you have it. Vast experience among all three, but very importantly, people who can identify, for those of you who are watching as linear radio people who work, I know you don't exclusively work just in linear radio anymore, but these are guys who've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, and now are exclusively working in the on-demand space. And that's why they're all qualified to try and help the rest of you dealing with the big dilemma of your move to digital, monetizing it, making it work, scaling it. Those are the big challenges you're all trying to cope with today. So I want to take all of you now, panelists, all of you back to your radio days. Each of you was responsible for changing from linear, FM or AM only, to growing new opportunities when it was clear that the internet was becoming very important for your audiences. I want to start with you, Chris Bannon. Tell me about those experiences, what you think you got right in that time, what, based on your reflecting now that you're doing something different, you've got some distance, what you could have done differently. So let's talk about the right and then what you could have done differently, where you think you made mistakes. Because I think importantly, for those who are watching, they want to know what mistakes not to make.
Well, thank you very much. That's a beautiful introduction, Omar. It's nice to see you all, or virtually see you all. I think WNYC did podcasting very early. As early as 2005, we were starting to put podcasts out of our radio shows. What really changed for us, I think, around 2008 or 2009 with a show called Freakonomics Radio is that we decided to look outside of our broadcast schedule for programming. Freakonomics started as a segment on Marketplace, which was a daily radio news program about business and the economy. And we realized that the programming for these audiences, these digital audiences, had to be different. Every show is kind of a channel in podcasting, and the sort of broadcast model of speaking to a vast general audience didn't seem to work as well as picking projects that were very specific and for very specific audiences. The second thing that we learned was that we could develop some things internally, but we also had to look for partners outside of WNYC in order to grow our network of shows. So what became WNYC Studios started with two internal things, Freakonomics Radio, well, three, Radio Lab, which became a podcast as well as a radio show, and a show called Death, Sex, and Money that was developed internally. But we also went out and signed deals with two independent podcasters, a food show, The Sporkful, and a parenting show, The Longest Shortest Time. We did that because they seemed to be opportunities to address specific audiences that were related to the public radio audience that we were already serving. They were journalists doing those shows who had experience with journalism and its rules, and they had shows that felt like they belonged, attached to a public radio audience. So I guess, Omar, those were the successes. I think probably we were too tentative in the beginning. We decided that the studios really would start with more internal than external shows. We didn't really fund staffing very fully. We didn't try as hard as we might have to really spend into the value that new audience represented. And I think if I had to do it over again, I'd be able to make a much better argument now for staffing up and going, because of course it's so much more competitive now too.
That last bit is a really pivotal point, and I want to come back to it because I want each of you to first talk about the experience, what you think you did right, what you think you would have done differently. So I'm going to come back to this issue of timing and when to go all in. Steve Goldstein, your experience.
So mine is in commercial radio, in the company that we built, Saga Communications. We were in about 100 markets. We were trading on the American Stock Exchange and then the New York Stock Exchange. And being a public company, that creates all sorts of complexity in terms of thinking more long-term. We were pretty focused on what December was going to look like or March. At the same time, we started building up a lot of different, let's just call them projects. They were all interactive in some form, mostly internet, not so much podcast initially. We at one point had 60 different digital initiatives, science projects, if you will. And I recall vividly a general manager taking all of those 60 initiatives and laying them out across the conference table and saying, pick three, you're making us crazy. And she was absolutely right. It is hard to innovate with so many different things happening in an organization. And so we narrowed the focus. But that focus also kept changing. I mean, again, podcast not initially on the radar. That was viewed as far too competitive and frankly, not very big. I admire so much WNYC and NPR and CBC because they were way ahead of commercial radio on the innovation front. But that's now caught up to commercial radio, in which they do have to start making decisions, and I'm sure we'll jump into that.
I was just making some notes about what you were saying, because I'm going to get back to this issue of the difference between having shareholders who look quarter on quarter and being in the public service, right? Where perhaps there's a little bit more leeway, and we have to grapple with that because a lot of our listeners will come from both sides of that particular divide, which perhaps it isn't. Chris Boyce, you're also at Canadian Broadcasting, which is, I guess, taxpayer funded. And so perhaps they can be a little bit more generous maybe, but let's hear your experience.
I think the hardest part, if I look back at those days, Omar, was everybody wants the future to be now, and the future isn't now right away. And it's interesting to hear Steve say, that, there was a time when you looked at podcasting and it wasn't very big, but that is absolutely the reality that you're living in, right? Is that you're living in a moment, and I'm now going sort of back in time 10 years, where you see something on the horizon that is really exciting. something that presents an immense amount of opportunity, right? And then there's the reality of what that thing actually is at that moment in time. So we were really excited at CBC about podcasting early on, right? Back to the very beginning of when it 2006, 2007, we launched a bunch of podcasts. I think everyone as a public broadcaster was really excited because podcasting had the potential to free us from the tyranny of the linear radio schedule, right? It allowed us to do a bunch of the stuff that Chris talked about that podcasting does really well. It allows you to go after niche audiences that you might not otherwise be able to reach. It allows you to do programming that doesn't fit neatly into that linear broadcast schedule. The problem is that potential is not immediately something that you can realize. And we would do research and we would, ask people, how many of you have listened to a podcast in the last month? And for so many years, and this is hard to imagine now because we've seen podcasting sort of break through into the mainstream, for so many years, that number was really small, right? It was like 11%. And then you'd ask the next year, it would be 11.5%. And then you'd ask the next year, it was like 12%. And the challenge was the medium was not yet reaching enough people to make a significant investment in it. So if I look back, what we tried to do was make intelligent investments, first beginning to think about what were existing programming assets that we could have, that we could move into the digital space, what were some very sort of, dipping your toe in the water experiments that we could make to sort of, put our stake in and begin to build that sort of on-demand audience in this new medium. So to me, that's my biggest recollection of the time, was the frustration of seeing this immense potential, but not being able to immediately to recognize it. If I look back and, mistakes, I do wish in hindsight that we'd invested in podcasting even earlier than we did. I think there was a lot of debate internally as to how were people going to consume this new on-demand content. Was it going to be on-demand streams? Was it going to be podcasting? What was it going to be called? And it is, to see how things have developed over the last, 5 years is really exciting. But I think in hindsight that there is probably even more of a stake we could have put into the ground early on.
So that's common among all three of you, is how tentative you had to be because of, not seeing results among audiences. We often have to be led by our audiences because we have to report to higher ups who say, but what's the opportunity there? So what should be the trigger? Because the longer you wait, it's happened in so many industries, it's others who see the opportunity, who are native to that opportunity because they don't have the albatross, which is what your current business potentially becomes. So what's the trigger that could have helped accelerate the movement into this on-demand opportunity, Chris Bannon?
That's a really interesting question, Omar. One thing that's interesting about the three of us is that we all made this move at exactly the same time, early 2015, right? It was 6 months after Serial or so, I think. And we
You mean leaving linear?
Leaving linear, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it leads
with
to
a lot of
answer.
wacky eye rolls at the time.
That's right. Well, we looked at it and I
What?
think we thought great programming is leading this medium, right? And that's, I think, the challenge for anyone who's in radio is that you have to shift the way you think about developing programming. It has to happen much more swiftly. You have to be able to kill things when they aren't working. When I was in radio, it was set it and forget it. There are still shows that I managed 7 years ago now that have been running in their 30 plus year. I had hosts who had been on the air since 1939 under me. And that was the beauty of radio, that companionship that goes on for decades. But I think that the audiences for digital media are insatiable and curious, and they have 100 million choices. So they're not going to wait for you to develop something cool on your 10th try. They're a little more impatient than that.
100 million choices, which is where the challenge is. We come from an environment where it's very finite and countable on your hands and toes, your competitors in a particular market. And now it's global and it's almost infinite. Chris Boyce, how would you know what the trigger is? So you said if you had to reflect back, and you've all said this, you would have invested more, you would have put more resources behind it. But how would you have got the higher ups convinced to do it? What would have been the metrics?
It's interesting. The question you're asking here is really how you build a new business inside of an existing business,
exactly.
Right? And there's a series of questions that I used to love that I've seen in books and people use in speeches, and it's this: why didn't Blockbuster invent Netflix, right?
Yeah.
Why didn't Sears create Amazon? Why didn't newspapers, invent Craigslist? And you could actually apply the same thing, I think, to our industry, right? Why didn't conventional radio invent or be the leader in podcasting? Why didn't NPR create the Daily instead of the New York Times? And I think often when this question is posed, it's framed as the innovator's dilemma, that people are afraid of disrupting themselves. And I actually don't know if the problem is that we're afraid of disrupting ourselves. I think the problem is sometimes we see the world through a very specific lens, and we need to think of a way to see the world through a different lens. So if you are a conventional radio station, you probably see your potential audience as your city, or maybe if you're like CBC or NPR, you might see your potential audience as your country, as opposed to what the technology is allowing, which is you to see the potential audience as the world, right? You may see yourself as a music station or only does music, or a news station that only does news. I think sometimes the challenge is not just that we're afraid of disrupting ourselves. The question is sort of like, we actually can't see a world that is bigger than the world we currently inhabit. So I think part of what you need to do is challenge some of those assumptions around what you could be doing or what you should be doing. I frequently talk to radio people in Canada who come to me and say, how can we make this jump to do podcasting? Or often how the question is framed is, how can I convince my boss to get into podcasting? And I say, well, what do you think you could win at? What do you think you could actually go out and win at in this crowded marketplace with hundreds of millions of choices? And often the answer they come back with is a version of what they're already doing with the constraints and restrictions of their existing terrestrial radio setup. They're like, well, I could make a great morning show, but it would be on a podcast instead of on the radio. I'm like, I don't know that there's a market for that.
Yeah. Stephen Goldstein, to take it to private enterprise working in this space, the corporations, could you say that we're held back because the incentives are perversely against us moving in this direction? Because they're saying it's the bottom line. That means you need more advertisers, or you need advertisers to spend more. It means you need to grow your listeners. And therefore, you don't even have the space to think about these things. And even if you do start, the thing is, well, we're not going to put money that way. You've got to get more money for us first. Is it that? Is it the way that incentives work for managers working in private companies that prevents us doing what, Chris has just said?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the company. I think it depends on the situation. I think it depends on the time. I like to think about this often going outside of the radio realm. There was a guy named Bob Wright, who was the chairman of NBC. And he came in, he was a GE guy, so he was, a suit and tie all the time. And he came into NBC sideways. He had been in the cable business. And he sat down with his key leadership and he said, we're going to die. That's essentially how he opened. We're going to die. And the crew looked at him, and we're talking about top-level executives. They said, we're winning with the Today Show. We're winning with the Tonight Show. We're winning with nightly news. We're winning with sports. What the heck are you talking about? And he said, every single day, more people are adopting cable and more people are watching cable. And every day our viewership is going to go down. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to invest in cable. Shocking. But that was from the most senior level, with a man with a great vision and the support of a significant corporation. Those things don't happen very often, but just to sort of run that all the way through, in a few years, 10 years, whatever it was, cable was generating more revenue for NBC than the traditional broadcast. Now, guess who was unhappy? The affiliates. The affiliates were horribly unhappy with everything that was going on. And now when you watch NBC, they're pushing you to their cable channels, they're pushing you to their app, they're pushing you to all sorts of digital sources, because their mission is to retain viewers wherever those viewers are. And so the imperative for radio today, as podcasting has become a lot easier, and the thing that Chris and I all came about at the same time, is podcasting wasn't easy. It wasn't native on the phone when I started. It was right after I started that occurred. And that's why Serial, by the way, was the success that it was. Great content, of course, but a lot of friction had been removed. And so I guess my point here is that all of this innovation has to occur at the right moment and the right time with the right leadership. And there's pain along the way. I mean, if I were an NBC TV affiliate today, I'd still be unhappy. But if they don't figure out ways to innovate locally, they'll perish.
So the truth is that as you enter this space, and you work in radio, you're entering a space where the barriers are gone, right? The competition, it can every day a new competitor arrives. That never happened when we worked in radio, right? It was telegraphed. Here's a guy who's got a spectrum. You've got time to prepare. You've got time to manage your marketing budget. None of that is possible anymore. How does a radio owner with a shareholder with a particular balance sheet that's structured in a particular way compete against what seems to be, among the streamers and the Spotifys of the world, venture capital funding? That's what's driving this, and some patience, right? Because the expectation in terms of a return on investment is very different. The horizon is different. Does that shift, where a different kind of approach from a funding model perspective, help radio? I think the answer is, maybe it's rhetorical even, but is that what's needed? Is that what's needed? Because right now it's all in corporations that in fact are just being saved from bankruptcy. If we talk about the US, they've all gone into bankruptcy protection. What makes linear radio compete effectively in this space, essentially, from a funding perspective? Because it is resource hungry.
I don't know, Omar, that I would go into this saying that this is going to be won by those who have the most money. There is certainly a lot of money flowing into the space, and there is certainly a lot of VC money flowing into the space. But if you look at what some of the most successful, podcasts are that are out there, they're not all, they're all capital intensive, right? Like, I look at the, Joe Rogans of the world. I look at Lore. I look at, all sorts of shows that began in a very small, organic way without a lot of money. And I think there, maybe because so much VC money has flowed into a bunch of companies, there's now this perception that you need to go in with this giant war chest. But some of the most successful podcasts out there, Mark Maron in his garage, like they may not have been started by somebody with no money, but they weren't massive investments. I think the challenge now is how you build the audience for that. It's not just the creation of it, but I think it's a fallacy to go in thinking at this, that it is only going to be successful if you are coming in with a massive war chest.
That's right. If you look at Joe Rogan, right, one of the biggest podcasters in the US, he started doing this years ago, and he does 3 hours a day, which no one would tell him to do today. He's a radio guy, right, who just adopted his model. I think it's a talent question, to build on what Chris was saying. I was listening to a promo for Criminal, a beautiful show hosted by Phoebe Judge, who does this with one or two other people, and whom Vox just acquired this year, right? She works out of Durham, North Carolina, and is just making her thing. And it's so, I think as a local, podcasts are international, right? They are global in their reach, but you have to look around the yard that you're in really hard and get to meet the people around you who might be the talent, the latent talent that are really ready and eager to work with you. And what you can provide is professionalism. You can give them an ear. You can help them structure their business. You can invest in them and then grow something together.
I think that's really critical. I think radio stations are looking to create this content inside their own walls. And first of all, they have fewer people than they used to have, so that's a problem. The bowling ball down the hallway problem is one that is made that much more difficult by where we are today with COVID. But those people may not be the people to do the next show. They've been trained to say Katy Perry up next, and I really don't mean to denigrate it. There are morning shows that do so well. They're powerful, they're smart, they're innovative. Some of them will do fantastic things in podcasting, and others will not. But I'll give you an example. I was working with a client in Philadelphia, and we came across a podcast produced by this woman, and it was just her hobby, and it was called Twisted Philly. Okay. And she just told odd stories about Philadelphia. What she was in need of was a megaphone to promote it and a sales organization to monetize it. By the way, she worked at Comcast during the week. She was just on their customer service team. This was something that she made and created all by herself on the side. She was early. She was too early, frankly. But I love the idea of that synergy, that the talent came to the radio station or was discovered by the radio station. And then there's this symbiotic thing that can occur where the stations can sell it and promote it. So that also alleviates this heavy problem of having to create it inside the building.
That's a really useful point, because it's one of the questions I wanted to pose to you anyway, and you've brought it up, which is great. Is, in your view, all three of you, as you reflect back again, is it better to have put a team, let's call it a SWAT team, whatever you want to call it, in a separate area to have built the proposition rather than inside the walls? There's this fantastic case study example of a company called Schibsted, out of the Scandinavian company that everybody uses, newspaper company, traditional newspaper print company, that did exactly that because they really couldn't get started. They couldn't do the Craigslist. It wouldn't have, but they created the best possible classified business because they put these guys on the other side instead of being constantly, their ideas constantly being trampled on by the existing guys. They moved them out. And then they created this incredible business. Is that what you would advise today for radio managers to do? To say, you guys manage the business, the linear business that you know so well. Get people who come from a different background, put them in a separate building, and let them create.
Omar, I wanted to do that at WNYC. Our director of business development, who was later my boss, Eric Dean at Stitcher, and I argued repeatedly that we should try to create a separate business from the radio side. It didn't have to be resourced equivalently, but I found that the pace of conversations with talent, with distributors, all of that stuff, it was really different from radio. And it was very hard to pull the attention from the things that were already on fire for radio and redirect it towards building a new business. And I think it would have been wise, another in the list of I wish I had's, it would have been wise for us to have set it up as a small business with its own, part-time lawyer and its own part-time business development executive and its own part-time sales staff, and just tried to let it grow organically without trying to pull the whole machine all the way together.
And when you hear the other views, Stephen, Chris, on that particular model.
I think it depends on where you're at, right? Mm-hmm. And I think if you are in a world where you have a really established existing business that is resistant to change, I think you're absolutely right to try to set it up as something different, because as Chris says, you're never going to get people thinking in the way that they need to think. I think you certainly are not going to be successful if you just go to a bunch of people who are already doing something else and say, okay, now create a bunch of on-demand content for me. And that seems very obvious, but I see that happening all the time and no thought is given. It's just like, okay, yeah, keep doing the morning show you're doing. Just, I need a whole bunch of on-demand content that I can pump out as a podcast and the salespeople are going to sell it. That is not going to work. Absolutely, hands down. On the other hand, if you're creating something new, I actually believe really passionately in a world where you create a team who thinks about all sorts of different destinations for the content that they are creating right from the outset. When I was at CBC, we had a daily culture show called Q. Q was a daily live radio show. It was an evening repackaged digest. It was a podcast. It was a weekly TV show. It had daily content on YouTube. There was content we spun off of it that ran on our music station. It ran in the States. It ran in Canada. We were able to do that because the team that was creating it was new. And they were a bunch of people who came from a world where some of them had only ever created YouTube content. They'd never made radio content. Some of them had only ever made sort of podcast content. They'd never worked in radio. So they were able to think of all of these destinations. I think ultimately, to me, that's where you want to be. You want to have a team of really engaged people and business support and audience development support that is making incredibly compelling content for a variety of different platforms and is always thinking about what is the most appropriate content for the platform. But I also realize that's not the reality that exists in a lot of organizations. So I think you need to look at your organization, figure out where are we on the curve and what is the most appropriate way to build something that gets you to the end result that you desire.
Stephen?
Yeah, and I totally agree with all of this. You know, part of the problem that we had was we'll meet on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. So it got its hour, and then everybody went back to whatever else they're going to do. But innovation comes from odd places or irregular places or out of necessity. I mean, there was a morning show in Seattle, and the program director, super sharp programmer, said, you know, the problem with the morning show as I'm seeing it is we're spending way too much time talking about technology and comics and gaming. And it turns out that the host, this is a highly rated show, that's what the host was really interested in. And the program director said, you know what, this is overwhelming the morning show. I have an idea. Why don't you do a podcast just on this topic? Mm-hmm. You're great at it, but we need to move it over here. Mm-hmm. And he did. And it relieved the morning show of a weight that was, you know, where it was headed in possibly a dangerous direction. But it created a new passion, venue, and an instant sales opportunity for the radio station. So sometimes it's just circumstantial or accidental, or somebody inside just thinking outside the box.
Yeah, but a great example. But the potential challenge there is that it's an orphan. And it's not a full business because Correct. It was opportunistic. And for it to be more than that, perhaps the model that we're discussing is something that those who are watching should be considering. A separate team that thinks only about this, not about the next sponsorship of a morning show or an afternoon drive or etc. They think only about this.
I think the issue there, Omar, is that for a lot of certainly broadcast companies in the U.S.,
yeah,
that is the right thing to do. I do think a separate unit spinning up all the ideas and, you know, running the science projects and doing all of that makes the most sense. It just may not be the most realistic way for a lot of these smaller operations to go. I mean, if you're in Indianapolis, if you're in Madison, Wisconsin, who is going to spin that up today? I think it should happen. I don't know how it happens.
So what happens in Madison, Wisconsin then, and other small markets around the world? These are people who will keep doing things the way they've always done, take a couple of toe dips in the areas as we've just described, but where does that leave them in the long run? What do you think the future of stations like that is? Are they sustainable? Because this environment is so different now. Chris Bannon.
I'm not sure toe dipping is going to work. And I'm thinking of two things in the US that are happening right now. David Plotz, who was the host of a very popular long-running politics talk show for Slate, has left a couple of different jobs over the years, but has landed as the founder of something called CityCast, I think. and he's investing in local markets. He's going to create daily podcasts for local markets all over the country. And there's a parallel movement in print, which these small newspapers all over the US that were, and I was a subscriber to my hometown paper until they finally ran some content I just couldn't stomach anymore. But the small town newspapers are seen now as another platform that might be very, very valuable from which you could spring podcasts or TikToks or all kinds of other media. And I think the people holding those papers, if they're like the editors of my hometown newspaper, are not seeing it coming, and they're doing business as usual. While outsiders are looking at local markets and saying, "Oh, there are 1 million people in Cleveland who deserve a daily podcast, and that would be monetizable if I just do it right."
And Axios is doing the same thing, developing out local news initiatives. I mean, today it's newsletters, could easily be podcasts tomorrow, but they are filling a void. I recall being at dinner with Jarl Mohn, who was running NPR at the time, and he said, if commercial radio is going to gut their newsrooms, I'm going to build my newsrooms. and that's the sort of thinking that builds audience over time. That's a strategic opportunity, a tactical opportunity as well. And that came about from him reading the marketplace and saying, all right, this is where we need to be. This is what we need to do.
You talked earlier, Chris Boyce, about, you said it doesn't have to be scale of funding, massive balance sheet, venture capital. So when you talked about those examples of people creating really compelling stuff out of their garage, the thought that occurred to me was, do they end up ever thinking their future is inside a radio business? Or do they immediately think, I'm not even going to go talk to those guys? Or if they approach me, they're not the ones I'm interested in talking to just because of who they are, what their brand represents today. Are radio brands going to completely miss out on this burgeoning talent because it's Spotify that's sexy?
At the end of the day, I don't think it's about who's sexy. It's about who can deliver results and who has the in-house expertise that is going to help you achieve your goal, right? So, Spotify might be sexy, but if I'm an independent podcaster creating something in my garage, what actually matters to me, right, is someone going to help me build an audience for my show? And I think that's probably the biggest hands down thing and no one thinks about. Everyone thinks about how am I going to create the content. No one thinks about how the hell am I going to get anyone to listen to it, right? So if you can be a radio operation that could help build digital audiences.
Let me interrupt, because the most horrible thing has happened to me. I've got to plug in my Mac. You keep talking.
I will. I'll cover for you, my friend.
Please do.
So nobody, so if you can be the person that helps build an audience for the guy in the garage, you are valuable, right? So then the second thing is, how am I going to make money off of this, right? So if you are going to be someone who can help monetize the podcast, you are going to be useful. I think Chris was talking earlier about what is it that brings value to, if you find somebody out there who's really talented, how are you going to help them shape what they do into a show or get better at, coaching them into being better talent? That has value. So I think if I was a conventional radio broadcaster, I'd be thinking about what has value in the new space and how can I be really good at it? And I think the thing that does worry me is that sometimes there is an arrogance. And I have this arrogance. I had this arrogance when I was in the conventional radio business, that just because I was good at doing conventional radio meant that I was going to be great at the digital space. And I think that arrogance sometimes is, I know how to make shows better than you do. I know content better than you do. I know how to sell spots on a terrestrial local radio station. Therefore, know how to monetize your podcast. That is not necessarily true, right? To be good at monetizing digital on-demand properties is different than being able to monetize a conventional radio station. I think there is perhaps even a different aesthetic that you're coaching talent for. There certainly is a different skill set around building an audience for a podcast or a digital show. But if you can be good at those things and you can prove you're good at those things, people will come to you because you are useful to them.
Do you all agree with that particular sentiment? As in, radio guys have a shot at this if there's new talent coming through, and they could be attractive to that new talent.
I think it depends on whether we're talking about local or national.
Right.
Both of the Chris's here are working on a national front, and I'm thinking more on the local front. It's different. It is different because it's not the same sort of CPM sell. There's not going to be 100,000 downloads. You better be thinking differently about how all of this gets monetized. But I do want to hit on what Chris Boyce was saying, and that is the radio stations do have those assets if they can figure out how to swing that around. I look at WTOP in Washington. So WTOP is the highest billing radio station in the United States, and the manager there is the guy who thinks ahead. I mean, he built a big internet presence. I think it's the 5th biggest internet presence in the city of Washington, or the metro area. And he is working diligently to build out this podcast model that I mentioned earlier, in which they discover local podcasts, they affiliate with them, they market them, they give them the megaphone, they sell them. And it's embryonic, it's nascent, totally nascent. But I love the concept, and I love the thinking behind it.
Mm. So just as you consider, and I'm going to get into a couple of other questions, I want you to start thinking, each of you, about the tips you would give people who work in radio today, who are all trying the things we're talking about, but not achieving the sort of scale that perhaps shareholders or their own ambition requires them to, because they think about their radio stations, and their radio stations have scale and big, large numbers of audiences, but that's not happening with the on-demand stuff. That's not happening with their streaming, their podcasts. How they should be thinking about their business, or what 5 or 3 even things they should be thinking about in order to convince, again, their higher ups if they're skeptical. And I think a lot of their shareholders are skeptical. When they walk into board meetings, they look at those numbers and they're not shifting the dial. That's the terminology that's often used. So think about that while we talk about the future of linear radio first. So let's talk about that, and then we'll get to your ideas and tips and tricks for people. When we think about radio as it is today, music radio, some people have said, the runway is short. Is there ever a scenario where the way music radio is currently run and programmed, where it can ever compete successfully with people making their own choices, customizing, personalizing?
I think there is. I ran WQXR, the classical station, alongside WNYC, Omar, when we bought it from the New York Times. And I feel that you have to invest in a couple of things. Really great music programming, right? So that it is absolutely the best thing you can hear when you turn it on. It's easy to do, right? It's much easier to just turn a switch on the radio than it is to dive into a stream somewhere, even though Spotify is wonderful and I use it all the time. The second thing is personality. People come, WQXR has a marvelous morning host, Jeff Spurgeon, and he's a companion to you in the morning, the way all traditional great radio broadcasters are. And I think, sure, sometimes you want just music, but I think the liveness of radio is something that podcasting and apps can't really deliver. That kind of electricity is still something that holds great potential for radio, however it gets delivered to me. I listen to it on my Echo Dot while I'm shaving. I'll listen to one of their opera streams sometimes, right? And so they found a new way to reach me in a place that didn't exist 5 years ago. and to program to me very specifically.
But even the dashboard's not sacrosanct. I mean, I know you're listening on the Amazon Dot, but the Echo Dot, but even the dashboard is no longer sacrosanct. It's under threat, right?
No, that's right.
So, but you say just that personality, that connection, that
The bots are not as
companionship.
good yet. Maybe someday they will be, but there's an app called Hark that is working really hard to develop personalized curation done by human beings around podcasting right now. And it's very impressive because they're showing you a way to listen that feels more tailored in some ways than some of the recommendations I get from Spotify are really about something the marketing department decided needed to be put in front of me, right? And there's a little independent curation is still valuable, I think.
Stephen, music radio's runway?
Limited for sure. I think about this through my own science projects. I have a 31-year-old, a 29-year-old, and a 23-year-old, and that laboratory is fascinating to watch. They will cume radio. They are in the cume. So when you hear radio talk about 91% or whatever the number is, they're in the cume. Not a lot of quarter hours, not a lot of time spent listening, and not a lot of love. But there is personality, authority, connection. Those things don't exist in the other services. The Spotify's, they're attempting to do that. Pandora, I think you're going to see all of them iterate and try and do that. But if they don't do that, local radio, if they don't maintain that, build that, rededicate themselves to that, I think it will hasten their demise.
Chris Boyce?
Yeah, you know what? I don't think we should ever underestimate the value of a low friction experience, right? And there is something about getting in the car and the radio comes on and I listen to it and I don't have to think about what playlist do I want to listen to. I don't even have to choose between Spotify's daily mix 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I think that opportunity will always be there, whether it's in the car, whether it's in the kitchen while I'm making breakfast. But I think the offer that radio is providing has to be compelling. And I come back to some of the stuff that, Chris and Steve were talking about is like, there has to be good personalities. It has to work live. There has to be an experience. I don't think, radio is never going to go back to the glory days that people, in the business may want it to go back to, but I don't think it's dead. I think we are probably somewhere in the middle. It is interesting watching kids, and I share, Steve's experience. My kids are a little younger. They're 12 and 15. They are mostly in a Spotify world, right? My 15-year-old was very excited. He had 75,000 hours of Spotify listening last year, which was split but fairly evenly between podcasts and music. We did some math. He was like spending a work day every day on Spotify listening. But, and I say this quite sincerely, he will get into the car and be excited about listening to Indie 88, which is a local linear terrestrial radio station, because he likes the mix of music. He actually still discovers music there that he then listens to on Spotify. He likes their imaging. The kids like their promotion. They like the personalities. And there are actually times where I'm the one going, really? We're going to listen to the radio instead of a Spotify playlist? So I think the opportunity is there. But if you are not delivering a compelling product and you keep watering your product down and you keep cutting costs, you are in the death spiral. And I have seen so many brilliant, great stations that have entered that death spiral. And as the revenue declines, the product declines. And as the product declines, no one wants to go and listen anymore. And it's a race to the bottom.
And but the frictionlessness, that's not going to be forever anyway. You talk about the frictionless experience. It's so easy. Just switch. That's almost, yeah.
But it's interesting. Like, I hear people trying to come up with the perfect on-demand listening experience tailored to my needs, and they're going to grab a newscast from NPR, and it's going to be
sure. That's complicated.
My favorite, and it sucks. It's an awful experience to listen to. It's horrible.
I agree.
Let's name the 5 companies that have already tried that and are gone. But I was talking with a program director who runs an AC station the other day, and he said that the best performing day part was evenings with Delilah, who's been on the air for 25 years. I mean, who knows what the number is? But I thought his analysis was spot on, that she was making a connection during a very difficult time for a lot of people, right? I mean, these are hard times. And most DJs, most shows, there's not a lot of empathy. She is all built around empathy and connection. And I didn't go to ask the next question, how did all the other stations do? But I'm going to bet that she's doing really well because she's delivering something that is unique.
Absolutely. So now let's get to that big question. We've got these hundreds of thousands of radio stations around the world all grappling with this, the shift to digital and the challenge of getting to the right metrics, being competitive, being sustainable. Your best ideas for them to be thinking about as they go into these strategy sessions. And one of you might say, well, just stick to your knitting and just be on FM. I don't know. You might say that. But let's hear how you think they should be approaching their next strategy getaway as they think about building in parallel or continuing to grow in parallel their digital footprint. I'm supposed to say Chris Boyce first.
Okay, I would say if you to break it down to the most essential elements, number one, what can I create that people actually want to listen to? So not what do I feel like making, or what do I feel like I should be making? What is there actually an opportunity in the market for? What is there actually listener demand for? That's number one. Number two, how am I actually going to get anyone to listen to it? I think the biggest mistake I see made time and time again is just like, I've created something, an audience will materialize. So I think absolutely you need to have a plan for how you're going to build that audience. And then the third is, how am I going to monetize it? And just because you're great at selling spots on a local radio station doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to monetize a podcast. So whether you're working with partners, whether you're rethinking your sales, I think you have to have a plan for how you're going to monetize it. So it's like, I think, to oversimplify, it's like, number one, create something really compelling that people actually want to consume. Number two, figure out how you're going to get them to listen to it, how you're going to build that audience. And number three, how you're going to monetize it.
Just on your number one, would you be thinking about whether it already exists in the market as well? This compelling, unique, I guess, might also be an important word, or not?
Well, I think you have to think about that, and the podcast marketplace is vast, right? Like if your mindset has been local radio in the market you're in, you are probably thinking about, depending on the size of your market, anywhere from 5 to 40 competitors, right? In the podcast world, you're looking at hundreds of thousands, millions of competitors, right? So I think you really have to shift your mindset in terms of, thinking about what you're doing and thinking differently about the competitive landscape that you're in.
Stephen Goldstein.
Well, I think you do have to distill things down to your asset, and your asset is local. There is all this other national, international content. I think it's unrealistic to think that you're going to come up with a better, travel show, tech show, whatever it is, but you may come up with a great show about Indiana that no one else can come up with. And so I think that is the key element, is coming up with something compelling that is differentiated. Really hard to do, but that's what you got. Your card is that you're the local media company, and so that's the one I would play first. And I agree with Chris that you got to create something that people want, and then the tyranny of the next one, which cannot be overstated, is finding the audience for it. And you will see over the next year, you're going to see podcasts perish like crazy because they're not going to find an audience, because they don't have a megaphone, or they're duplicating content that already exists, that the social channels and things that people have been using to promote podcasts aren't working as effectively. So you already, there's ostensibly 2.5 million podcast titles out there, of which, over 1 million, easy over 1 million are dead and gone, and that number is just going to increase. So now add that into the big pile of stuff that you got to deal with. I have a friend who says choice kills, and I think he's exactly right. So you've got to get that unique content, and the marketing is really critical, and the sales dollars, they'll follow ears. That's the way that has to work.
Just let me test something with you. So would you know, we talk about tentpole for movies and so on, and there was a time when, because there's so much now, there's so much content everywhere, that the investment in marketing sometimes outstrips the investment you make in content, because you have to shout louder in more places than ever before.
Welcome to
Is
the
that
film
what's
business. That's the film business in Hollywood, right?
exactly?
It's become Hollywood.
Exactly. Is that correct? Is that assumption right? Chris Bannon?
Well, I don't know whether it's the right thing. I mean, I think that some people spend like that because they feel it's necessary to do, because they have no other sufficient mechanisms for getting an audience. But I'm not sure that it works in every case, right? It really depends so much on how the quality of the thing being made, and then are you spending it wisely, or are you putting it on Woodworking Podcast somewhere out there and hoping for a big hit because the ad buy was cheap? No offense to woodworkers out there.
There are a lot of woodworking podcasts. That too is a crowded area.
That question, though, Omar, of like, are you spending it wisely, is a good one. I have seen people launch podcasts and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on promotional budget that they might as well have flushed down a toilet, because it wasn't thought out well in terms of where they spent it or how they spent it. So, yes, you need to think deliberately, but I think it's not just about the size of the spend. It's about is the effort being done strategically and intelligently.
Right.
Chris Bannon, your tips?
It's really unfair of you to make me do this last after these two guys. I would say, because I have versions of everything they've said, and I agree with what they've pointed out. I would say
well, you're the one who had the Prairie Home Companion right at the beginning of your career, so of course you deserve some tough stuff now.
Yeah, it's all been downhill since then. I mean, I think a good business plan, really know what you're trying to do. Don't just sit around and talk about it and go off in a lot of directions. Pick an audience, pick a set of goals, metrics that you want to achieve that seem, reasonable +5, but don't sit there with an unreasonable set of expectations, or worse yet, no expectations. Try to aim for things I find leads me to succeed, rather than simply sitting down and saying, let's make a podcast, go off and do that, right?
What do you mean? Set a goal in terms of metrics. I want to get to X many people. Or what exactly do you mean? Just explain that.
Well, I mean, at Stitcher, for instance, we would decide every year how many small, medium, and large size podcasts we would try to make in the coming year. During the conversations about budget, we actually started that from, well, how much inventory do we expect to be able to sell? Ad inventory. That will lead us to think about what kinds of bets we can make on different sizes of shows. That would lead me to think about how much staff I need to make those shows, and what kinds of staff, which genres are we going to go after? True crime is a big thing. So if we're trying to create 2 very big hit shows, one of them should probably be a true crime thing in the marketplace. And from that, we think about, what's the most creative way that we could approach the true crime audience? So you really have to, we had a plan without knowing what content was going to be in the plan, that sometimes I think at our busiest year, we were launching 20 new shows. But all of them were planned for a year before we knew what they were going to be. We thought about audiences and about revenue. The other 2 points I'd make, I guess, are that I think collaborating now for local markets is a really smart thing. And if you have smart people in your market who are doing interesting things, start having lunch with them. Start trying to figure out what they do that you're not doing that might be interesting for your audience. And then I think the last thing, the hardest thing for anyone who's a broadcast professional, is listen more, right? I mean, I'm sick of listening to podcasts sometimes and listen to music often when I go on my pandemic walks. But I do think understanding what's different about podcasting and how how it talks to listeners differently is the most important thing. You have to hear that difference and understand it, and find people on your staff or in your community who sort of epitomize that difference. Do it intuitively, do it naturally. You can force people to be good podcast hosts with a lot of training, but that's a resource investment that most people don't have, and it takes a long time. So I think listening is the last thing I would leave you with.
Brilliant. Gentlemen, this has been amazing. Chris Boyce, Pacific Content. Chris Bannon from Condé Nast Global. Steve Goldstein, Amplify Media. Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your experience, for sharing so freely. And hopefully those of you who are watching on redtech.pro or wherever you're watching this particular session, you found something here that you've started to make notes about, that you're going to take into your next strategy session, that's going to convince the people that matter in your life that there is an opportunity here for growing the opportunity outside linear, outside radio, and that if you don't do it, as our guys have said, you are constraining your future, you're constraining the sustainability of your medium. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.